Hey everybody, this is an article from the edited volume, the Trotsky Reappraisal, which is edited by Terry Brotherstone and Paul Dukes. This piece is titled The Defense of Terrorism, Trotsky and His Major Critics. Wikipedia for George Kline says, George Kline lived from 1921 to 2014. George Kline was a philosopher, translator, especially of Russian philosophy and poetry, prominent American specialist in Russian and Soviet philosophy, author of more than 300 publications, including 2 monographs, 6 edited or co-edited anthologies, more than 165 published articles, book chapters and encyclopedia entries, over 55 translations and 75 reviews. The majority of his works are in English, but translations of some of them have appeared in Russian, German, French, Spanish, Portuguese, Polish, Serbo-Croatian, Korean, and Japanese. George L. Kline is particularly noted for his authoritative studies on Spinoza, Hegel, and Whitehead. George L. Kline was president of the Hegel Society of America from 1984 to 1986 and president of the Metaphysical Society of America 1985 to 1986. George L. Kline has also made notable contributions to the study of Marx and the Marxist tradition. He attended Boston University for 3 years between 1938 and 1941, but his education was interrupted by service in the U.S. Army Air Corps during World War II, for which he was awarded the Distinguished Flying Cross. He was born in 1921 and died in 2014. And on the side it says his era was 20th century philosophy, region Western philosophy, school continental philosophy, main interests political philosophy, ethics, Russian philosophy, Slavic studies, Russian poetry, and notable ideas are Nietzschean Marxism. After the war, George L. Kline completed his undergraduate education with honors at Columbia University, 1947, followed by graduate degrees at Columbia University, MA 1948, PhD 1950. Kline taught philosophy at Columbia University from 1950 to 1952 and 1953 to 1959, and was visiting assistant professor at the University of Chicago, 1952 to 53. Kline moved to Bryn Mawr College in Bryn Mawr, Pennsylvania in 1959, initially teaching in both the philosophy and the Russian departments. George L. Kline was appointed full professor of philosophy in 1961, becoming a Milton C. non-professor of philosophy from 1981 until his retirement in 1991. Afterwards, Kline served as a professor of philosophy at Clemson University, South Carolina, between 1992 and 1993. George L. Kline also taught 1-semester courses at Rutgers University, Johns Hopkins University, University of Pennsylvania, Haverford College, and Swarthmore College. Beginning in 1952 at the University of Chicago, George L. Kline first taught his famous course on Russian ethical and social theory. It was subsequently taught at Columbia University through the 1950s, at Bryn Mawr College from 1960, and at a number of other institutions over the years. George L. Kline also taught more or less continuously courses on the history of Russian philosophy, Russian and Soviet Marxism, and a number of courses on Russian literature. The entire field of Russian philosophy as an object of study in America has been shaped to a remarkable degree by the efforts of George L. Kline himself over the course of a long career, beginning with his last publications in 1949, Dostoevsky's Grand Inquisitor and the Soviet Regime, published in Occidental No. 2, and A Note on Soviet Logic, published in Journal of Philosophy, Volume 46. The textual precision, historical learning, and depth of insight found in Kline's own numerous studies of Russian and Soviet philosophy over several decades have served as a model of serious scholarship on these topics and many other researchers. He is also responsible for making available in English some of the most important reference works in the field, including the English translation of Zenkovsky's History of Russian Philosophy, and with others, Russian Philosophy, a 3-volume anthology of original translations of Russian philosophical texts continuously in print from 1965 to the present. Kline has also supplied a large number of entries on Russian philosophers for a variety of philosophical encyclopedias over many years. George L. Kline has written approximately 75 reviews of other scholars' works on Russian and Soviet philosophy, as well as new Soviet philosophical works. For example, during the 1950s, George L. Kline reviewed approximately 30 recent Soviet publications in the fields of formal logic, philosophy of logic, and philosophy of mathematics, principally for the Journal of Symbolic Logic, as the field of formal logic was opening up in the USSR. George L. Kline has also published several authoritative bibliographies of works in Russian and also in other languages concerning the history of Russian thought and culture, as well as a bibliography of Brodsky's published writings. Finally, Kline's skills as an editor are legendary. George L. Kline contributed his services to a great many publishing ventures connected with Russian and Soviet philosophy, including the Sovietica series of monographs and the journal Studies in Soviet Thought. On a personal level, George L. Kline most generously assists in the editing of other scholars' drafts of works in philosophy, intellectual history, literature, and literary criticism, and has been a constant source of encouragement and support for younger scholars. In all of these ways, Kline has placed his own irreplaceable mark upon the entire field. In 1949 to 1950, George L. Kline was in Paris as a Fulbright scholar, just as V.V. Zenkovsky's book, something in Russian, 2 volumes, 1948 and 1950, was being published there. While in Paris, George L. Kline met Zenkovsky and volunteered to translate the history into English, completing it after returning to the U.S. During this process, Zenkovsky introduced revisions and corrections for incorporation into the English translation, so that Kline's translation became the authoritative text. The authoritative version of the text. This work became the standard history of Russian philosophy for the next half century, a crucial reference source for all scholars of Russian philosophy. In addition to Kline's translation of Zenkovsky, another exceptionally important source for English-speaking students of Russian philosophy has been the comprehensive 3-volume collection of original translations of Russian philosophers from the 18th century, up through early Soviet Marxism, Russian philosophy, edited with James M. Eddy, James P. Scanlon, and Mary Barbara Zeldin, with the collaboration of George L. Kline, published in 1960, revised in 1969, and in 1976. Whoa, this Wikipedia, it's way too long. Holy shit, I just realized how long it was. Sorry about that. I'm not going to read that whole thing. That's way too much. Sorry, I thought it was shorter than that. I'm not going to read that whole thing. Sorry. This chapter explores the ideological, and this is the text now. This chapter explores the ideological and philosophical presuppositions of Trotsky's defense of terrorism as a necessary present means for achieving the desired future end of socialism/communism, namely Trotsky's quite Marxist-Leninist hatred and contempt for the historical present and his powerful orientation towards the historical future. Of the 2 major critics of Trotsky's position considered here, only Dewey, a non-Marxist, sensed, if without full clarity or self-consciousness, the connection between Trotsky's future orientation and his readiness to devalue and instrumentalize present human lives. I've had a good deal to say in other places about the obsessive future orientation of Marx and the Marxist-Leninists, including Trotsky, a position which involves both what I have called the ontological, quote, fallacy of the actual future, end quote, and the related, quote, parenthesis, axiological, end parenthesis, quote, fallacy of historically deferred value, end quote. These philosophical errors result in a moral monstrosity, the devaluing and instrumentalizing of present existence, communities, cultures, practices, and especially persons, for the sake of a, quote, world historical future, end quote, treated as actual in the sense of being both definite and valuable. No present existent is held to have intrinsic, non-instrumentalizable value. Consequently, every present existent, living person, in particular, may justifiably be treated as a means, as something having only instrumental value, positive if it facilitates, negative if it obstructs, for the producing of the existence of the remote historical future. Those future existents, whether communities, cultures, practices, or persons, are treated in the present as ends, entities which will, in the remote future, have or acquire the intrinsic value that is denied to present existence. The groups, classes, and individuals against whom Trotsky is ready, indeed eager, to direct the sword of revolutionary terror are held to be particularly and unacceptably obstructive of the future-oriented process of the, quote, building of communism, end quote. In his magisterial study of Trotsky's social and political thought, Kline declares, quote, Marxism was the most future-oriented of doctrines, a fact so obvious as to require little elaboration. Rejecting the whole existing reality, Marxism enthusiastically contemplated the necessary advent of a novel (future) and society. The promise of a future and millennium was inherent in Marxism, and the chiliastic dream was certainly a part of its appeal. End quote. Kline Paz. Footnote. The first footnote says there's two footnotes, one that I missed. See my essay Present, Past, and Future as categorical terms and the, quote, fallacy of actual future, end quote, in Review of Metaphysics, and my article The Use and Abuse of Hegel by Nietzsche and Marx, published in Nietzsche and His Critics, Philosophy in the Aftermath of Hegel, edited by William Desmond. I'm looking this book up now. Sorry, I'm looking up the other things as well. One moment, forgive me. This video sucks. All right. So the description for Hegel and his critics says, this book deals with fundamental problems in Hegel, with Hegel in relation to Kierkegaard, Marx, Nietzsche, Russell, Heidegger, Husserl, Derrida, and Bataille. It reveals Hegel's power to provoke both critical and creative thought across the complete spectrum of philosophical questions. And and the description of the bio of the editor, William Desmond, says, William Desmond is the author of Art and the Absolute, a study of Hegel's aesthetics, and is chair of philosophy at Loyola College, Baltimore. Yeah. End footnote. Next footnote, and this is what I was looking up just now, so hopefully I'll be able to just hop right into it. See Kline Paz, The Social and Political Thought of Leon Trotsky. See also Ernst Bloch, Das Prinzip Hoffnung in Werke, Gesamtausgabe, published in 1959, Volume 5. Cited by Stephen Lukes in Marxism and Morality. And Joel Tabora, The Future in the Writings of Karl Marx. So the description that I'm finding for Marxism and Morality by Stephen Lukes says, it is reported that the moment anyone talked to Marx about morality, he would roar with laughter. Yet plainly Marx was fired by outrage and a burning desire for a better world. This paradox is the starting point for Marxism and morality. Discussing the positions taken by Marx, Engels, and their descendants in relation to certain moral issues, Stephen Lukes addresses the questions on which Marxist thinkers and actors have taken a number of characteristic stands, as well as other questions, personal relations, and the moral virtues of the individual, for example, on which Marxism falls silent. A provocative exploration of the gray area between Marxism and morality meet. This book argues that Marxism makes a number of major moral claims, and that its appeal has always been, in large part, a moral appeal. And now I'm waiting for this page to load. The Future and the Writings of Karl Marx, an evaluative interpretation based on primary sources by Joel Tabora. And the description for this book says, it was in critical humanistic intent that Marx attempted the overturning of Hegel's dialectic and historical materialism, understanding future humanity as the necessary overcoming, Aufhebung, of private productivity, which fails to satisfy man's human need. This study, based on a spectrum of primary sources from the young to the mature Marx, presents the critical function and the praxis-inductive role in the future. The praxis-inductive role the future had in Marxist thought. The promise that continues to live in this thought is thereby explicated. It is, however, a promise premised on a persistent idealism in Marx's claim to materialism, which compromises the depth of man's human need in a future whose realization is necessarily only future. Back to the text and footnote. In Trotsky's Testament of 1940, Trotsky ringingly asserted, quote, I shall die with unshaken faith in the communist future. This faith in man and man's communist and future gives me even now such power of resistance as cannot be given by any religion. End quote. Trotsky, Diary in Exile. As we shall see, this powerful commitment to and faith in the communist future also gave Trotsky, as it has given countless other Marxist-Leninists, an unshakable conviction that their devaluing and instrumentalizing of the lives of present persons for the sake of that radiant communist future was unquestionably and unqualifiedly justified. The view defended in detail by Trotsky was shared by other Bolsheviks, including both Lenin and Lunacharsky. Lenin's statements, though characteristically brief and programmatic, bluntly proclaimed the instrumentalizing view of morality and of the present, which Trotsky was to defend. Perhaps Lenin's most famous statement was made in 1920, quote, at the foundation of communist morality lies, the present, struggle for the strengthening and future completion of communism, our morality is wholly subordinated to the interests of the class struggle of the proletariat, end quote. Lenin. The problem of ends and means, terrorism and the dictatorship of the proletariat was posed sharply, not only at the level of theory, but even more urgently at the level of policy and practice. In the early years of the Soviet regime, during this period, Lenin continued to put his instrumentalizing theory into practice, but he wrote relatively little on the subject. Lenin did sketch the position elaborated by Trotsky in 1920 and 1938, that violence used by the exploiters is directed against the historical development of mankind and thus is historically doomed, but violence used against the exploiting minority who are blocking historical progress is effective, and those who use it can be confident of success. Quote, in general, Lenin declared, socialism is opposed to violence against human beings. However, except for Christian anarchists and Tolstoyans, no one has ever concluded from this that socialism is against revolutionary violence. Thus, to speak of, quote, violence in general, without any analysis of the conditions which distinguish reactionary violence from revolutionary violence, is to be a Philistine who renounces the revolution, or else simply to deceive oneself and others with sophistry. End quote. Lenin. Wait, hold on. That's the footnote is saying to Lenin. Didn't he say this was Trotsky? Oh no, they did say no. This is Lenin. Sorry, yeah, no, that's right. Sorry. Uh, the chief theoretical statement of the Lenin-Trotsky position was evoked by grave charges brought in 1919 by Karl Kautsky, leading spokesman of European democratic socialism. Kautsky sharply attacked what he called the Bolsheviks' quote, immoral and anti-democratic, end quote, methods, making specific reference to the quote, Red Terror. Footnote. See Kautsky, Terrorismus und Kommunismus, ein Beitrag zur Naturgeschichte der Revolution. Published in Berlin, 1919. The description of this book of Terrorism and Communism, a contribution to the natural history of revolution, by Kautsky, starts with a quote. It says, quote, not blind glorification of the previous methods of the revolution, but their strictest criticism is necessary, is most urgently needed precisely now, when the revolution and the socialist parties within it are going through a serious crisis in which different methods are fighting with each other for validity, end quote. Kautsky. This critical attitude identifies Karl Kautsky, who lived from 1854 to 1938, social democratic politician and journalist, as both a participant and a partisan, contemporary witness to, in the best sense of the word, and makes him a suitable mediator of this era. Begun on the eve of the November Revolution and completed in 1919 under the impression of its development, Karl Kautsky's Terrorism and Communism clearly conveys the field of tension in which left-wing ideas developed in this, quote, wildly fermenting time, end quote, as Kautsky himself describes it. Kautsky's train of thought spans from the French Revolution and the terror of its late phase through the Paris Commune to the Soviet Republic and the German November Revolution. Back to the text. There is an unsatisfactory English translation titled Terrorism and Communism, a Contribution to the Natural History of Revolution, published in 1921. End footnote. Trotsky answered these charges the following year in a slim volume entitled Terrorism and Communism. Kautsky published a reply in 1921 and a final word in 1930. Footnote. Von der Demokratie zur Staatsklärerei einer Auseinandersetzung mit Trotsky. Seeing if there's a description of this book anywhere. No, I'm not seeing anyone, but it is available on Marxist.org. End footnote. Footnote. Der Bolschewismus in der Sackgasse. Look that up. I'm not seeing any description of it. According to AI, der Bolschewismus in der Sackgasse, translated as Bolshevism at a Deadlock in English, is a book written by Karl Kautsky, a prominent Marxist theorist, where he criticizes the policies of the Soviet Union under Vladimir Lenin and Joseph Stalin, arguing that their radical approach to communism had reached a point of failure due to its extreme measures and economic mismanagement, essentially leading to a, quote, deadlock in the development of a socialist society. Back to the text and footnote. Again, that was AI, so you got to be cautious about what that says. But back to the text and footnote. After Kautsky's death in 1938, Trotsky, then in exile in Mexico, returned to the subject in the article Their Morals and Ours. Trotsky's, quote, theoretical, end quote, justification of recourse to terrorism, violence, and deception on the part of revolutionary governments may be reduced to four, quote, theses, of which the first two are in his own eyes most important and impressive, and less historically conditioned or contingent, in other words, more theoretical, more clearly a matter of, quote, principle. 1. Ends and means are separable, dissociable, and a good (future) end justifies any (present) means. Therefore, different socioeconomic classes may use the same means (e.g. terrorism) to achieve very different, even opposed ends. 2. Socialism cannot be achieved, at least under present 1920 conditions of capitalist encirclement and intervention, without revolutionary violence and repression. Whoever desires the end of socialism must accept the means of terrorism. 3. All governments use violence to stay in power, and all historical revolutions have used violence to break that power. 4. The reign of terror in Russia was started not by the Bolsheviks but by the counter-revolutionary White Guard forces. In other words, the White Terror came first, the Red Terror was only a response to it. During this polemical exchange, Kautsky attacked, and the Bolsheviks, prominently including Trotsky, defended Lenin's position. Trotsky refused to recognize any moral limitations upon the choice of means, concluding that terrorism, violence, and deceit were all antecedently justified by their serving to bring about the good end of communism. Kautsky, in contrast, insisted that Bolshevik terrorism represented not only a reversal of the historical trend toward an increasingly humane morality, but also a violation of the sanctity of human life, a refusal to recognize the human individual as a Selbstzweck, end in himself. Quote, the end, Kautsky wrote, quote, does not sanctify every means, but only those which are in harmony with the quote end does not sanctify every means, but only those means which are in harmony with the end quote. Kautsky. In other words, Kautsky held that there are certain moral principles or values which set absolute and inviolable limits to the choice of means to realizing given socio-political ends. Kautsky thus came very close to Kant and Trotsky, who derisively repudiated Kautsky's, quote, Kantian clerical vegetarian Quaker chatter about the sanctity of human life, end quote, could justly charge that Kautsky had taken up a position inconsistent with Marxian ethical relativism. It is clear that Kautsky's advocacy of a constitutional winning of power by socialists through free elections, accompanied by education in the aims of socialism, and Kautsky's insistence that only thus could the end be kept uncorrupted, are much closer to the democratic and humanistic traditions of the West than is Trotsky's future-oriented revolutionary instrumentalism. But who is closer to Marx? Kautsky did not deny that Marx had favored revolutionary violence and terrorism in 1848, but Kautsky insisted that by 1871, Marx had come to the conclusion that bloodshed and terror were not necessary to revolutionary success. Footnote. In a passage referred to by Kautsky and Trotsky, Marx declared, quote, "There is only one means by which the murderous death agonies of the old society and the bloody birth throes of the new, future society can be shortened and concentrated, and that is by revolutionary terror." End quote. Marx, Neue Rheinische Zeitung, 7 November 1848, in Marx Engels Collected Works. This passage is regularly cited by Soviet commentators who are making the Leninist Trotskyite distinction between future-oriented revolutionary terrorism and past-oriented reactionary terrorism, e.g. by N.A. Baliev and M.D. Shargorodsky. End footnote. And Kautsky implies that this doctrinal shift was a result of wider experience and maturity. Quote, Marx, Kautsky wrote, quote, was completely right when he pointed out with satisfaction that the Second Paris Commune was free of all acts of violence of which the first had seen so many, end quote. Kautsky. Kautsky adds that as early as 1872, quote, Marx expressed his expectation that in such countries as America, England, and Holland, the proletarian revolution could take on peaceful forms, end quote. Kautsky. Trotsky can hardly restrain his impatience with such views. Kautsky, Trotsky declares acidly, is not a revolutionary Marxist. Kautsky's theory of history is the vulgar 18th century doctrine of peaceful progress. For Kautsky, Trotsky says sarcastically, the, quote, whole of history reduces to a continuous ribbon of printed paper, and Kautsky's venerable writing desk stands at the bracket very end bracket center of this, quote, humane, end quote, process, end quote. I shall try to state the essence of Trotsky's four, quote, theses as systematically and concisely as possible, formalizing Trotsky's argument somewhat, but leaving its substance unchanged. 1. Trotsky insists that different socioeconomic classes may use analogous means, e.g. terrorism, for totally distinct and opposed ends. This follows, Trotsky suggests, from the essential separability and independence of ends and means. Footnote. Trotsky's reference in 1938 to the, quote, dialectical interdependence of means and ends, end quote, is only an apparent and superficial qualification of this basic position. End footnote. What is moral and justified when directed towards one end is immoral and unjustified when directed towards a different end. Trotsky in 1938 put this in a graphic image, quote, only contemptible eunuchs, end quote. Trotsky wrote, quote, maintain that the slave owner who by deceit and violence places a slave in chains is the equal before morality of the slave who, by deceit and violence, casts off his chains, end quote. The same point had been made more solemnly by an official of the Soviet secret police, Cheka, in 1918. Quote, murder, lies, and treachery are amoral, bracket, i.e. immoral, end bracket, and shameful if they are harmful to the cause of the proletarian revolution. These same lies, treachery, and murder are moral and laudable if they serve this, bracket, future-oriented, end bracket, revolution, end quote. Footnote: Martin Latsis, quoted in V.S. Grechko, something in Russian. Wikipedia says Martin Latsis lived from 1888 to 1938 and was a Latvian Bolshevik revolutionary, Soviet politician, and senior state security officer of the Cheka from Courland, now Latvia. There's a brief Wikipedia. The Wikipedia article is actually really brief, so I'm just going to read it real quick. Born in the family of a Latvian farm worker, Latsis was a member of the Bolshevik faction of the Russian Social Democratic Labor Party from 1905, a quote old Bolshevik, an active participant in the Russian Revolution of 1905 to 1907 and 1917, a member of the Military Revolutionary Committee, a member of the Collegium of the All-Russian Cheka, 1918 to 21, and chairman of the Cheka in Ukraine, 1919, and a member of the VTSIK, Between 1932 and 1937, Martin Latsis was a director of the Plekhanov Moscow Institute of the National Economy. Martin Latsis was the author of the book titled 2 Years of Struggle on the Internal Front, in which he advocated unrestrained violence against class enemies. He boasted of the harsh repressive policies used by the Cheka. In 1918, while a deputy chief of the Cheka in Ukraine, Martin Latsis called for sentences to be determined not by guilt or innocence but by social class. Martin Latsis is quoted as explaining the Red Terror as follows, quote, "We are not fighting against single individuals. We are exterminating the bourgeoisie as a class. Do not look in materials you have gathered for evidence that a suspected act or spoke against the Do not look in materials you have gathered for evidence that a suspect acted or spoke against the Soviet authorities. The first question you should ask him is what class he belongs to, what is his origin, education, profession. These questions should determine his fate. This is the essence of the Red Terror," end quote. Martin Latsis. While praising Latsis's abilities, Lenin criticized Latsis's advocacy of indiscriminate class terror as, quote, absurd and risking, quote, untold harm to communism, end quote. Quote, "Political distrust means we must not put non-Soviet people in politically responsible posts. It means the Cheka must keep a sharp eye on members of classes, sections, or groups that have leanings toward the White Guards. Though, incidentally, one need not go to the same absurd lengths as Comrade Latsis, one of our finest tried and tested communists, did in his Kazan magazine, Krasny Terror. He wanted to say that Red Terror meant the forcible suppression of exploiters who attempted to restore their rule, but instead, he put it this way. On page 2 of the first issue of his magazine, quote, don't search the records for evidence of whether this revolt against the Soviet was an armed or only a verbal one," end quote. Political distrust of the members of a bourgeois apparatus is legitimate and essential, but to refuse to use them in administration and construction would be the height of folly, fraught with untold harm to communism, end quote. Lenin. On November 29, 1937, during the so-called, quote, Latvian operation, Martin Latsis was arrested, accused by a commission of NKVD and prosecutor of the USSR of belonging to a, quote, counter-revolutionary nationalist organization, end quote, and executed in 1938 by shooting in the Butovo firing range. In 1956, the military collegiate of the Supreme Court of the USSR politically rehabilitated Martin Latsis. Back to the text and footnote. And in 1921, A.V. Lunacharsky declared, quote, although it is abominable in the hands of a ... past-oriented, reactionary government, violence is sacred, ! and necessary in the hands of a bracket future-oriented and bracket revolutionary, end quote. A.V. Lunacharsky. Further questions remain, however. Assume for the moment that one could agree with Trotsky, as Kautsky did during their polemical exchange, that socialism is a, quote, good end, where the criterion of, quote, goodness, in Trotsky's own words, is the extent to which the given socioeconomic order, quote, leads to the increase of man's power over nature and the abolition of the power of man over man, end quote. Trotsky. The difficulty arises when it is proposed to use terrorism, violence, and deception as a means for attaining this, quote, good, end quote, end. There are at least two possibilities. A. One who accepts socialism as the ultimate end may disagree with others and with the, quote, leaders, end quote, of the Revolutionary Party about the effectiveness of terrorism as a means. Such a disagreement would be a theoretical disagreement, and that disagreement could presumably be settled, as Trotsky tries to settle it, by appeals to evidence and logic, the final argument being, but it is working, and it has worked. B. Even one who agreed with Trotsky about the effectiveness or expediency of terrorism as a means for achieving socialism might, with Kautsky, conclude that such means conflict radically with some other norm or principle, e.g., respect for human life or individual rights. In other words, one might find the means theoretically effective, but morally unacceptable. Then one could either 1. Have recourse to a less effective, but nevertheless not totally ineffective, means of realizing the given end, socialism. This is precisely what Kautsky did in his appeal to constitutional parliamentary reform, or else, 2. If it can be shown, as Trotsky tried to do, that terrorism, violence, and deceit are the only possible means of establishing socialism, one must accept them, recognize their immorality, but asserting that these immoral means are justified by the good end, or else give up the end altogether. Trotsky does not recognize any moral limitation upon the use of terrorism. Trotsky insists that the degree and nature of repressive measures are purely a matter of expediency, not a matter of principle. But Trotsky explicitly repudiates any Kantian, quote, metaphysical bourgeois, end quote, dictum, that the dignity and worth of the individual person should be respected, asserting that, where necessary, individuals are and should be treated merely as means. Kautsky had charged that the architects of the Red Terror, unlike the initiators of the White Terror, who, after all, on his view, were mostly representative of the exploiting classes, violated their own principles, in particular the principle of the, quote, sanctity of human life, which they themselves have proclaimed, end quote. Trotsky, of course, is emphatic in his denial that he or any other Bolshevik leader ever subscribed to such a principle. Indeed, Trotsky calls it the most hypocritical and stupid, quote, principle imaginable. So long, Trotsky insists, as society is exploitative and predatory, the, quote, principle of the, quote, sanctity of human life, end quote, remains the basest lie, intended to keep oppressed slaves in their chains, end quote. In other words, it applies primarily to the life of the exploiter and oppressor, and is invoked to protect the exploiter and oppressor from the righteous indignation of his victims. Quote, in order to make the individual person sacred, bracket, in the future, end bracket, one must, bracket, in the present, end bracket, destroy the social order which crucifies the individual, and this task can be carried out only with iron and blood, end quote. Trotsky. 2. Trotsky's reference to, quote, iron and blood leads us directly to Trotsky's second main, quote, thesis. Without terrorism, it is impossible to achieve socialism. Quote, anyone who renounces terrorism in principle, bracket, Trotsky declares, end bracket, must, bracket, also, end bracket, renounce the political rule of the working class, its revolutionary dictatorship, Anyone who renounces the dictatorship of the proletariat also renounces the social revolution and writes, quote, finis to socialism, end quote. Footnote. Trotsky even speaks of the proletariat's edinovlasti, literally, quote, monarchy or, quote, monopoly of power. Monarchy and monopoly of power are very, very radically different terms. Back to the text. Socialism, Trotsky had, means a society without class divisions, without exploitation, wholly, quote, without deceit and violence, but it is not possible to throw a bridge toward that bracket future and bracket society, except by the methods of violence, end quote. Quote, violent revolution was necessary in Russia, end quote, according to Trotsky, quote, because the undeferrable demands of history, bracket, sick, exclamation point, end bracket, proved incapable of clearing a road to bracket, to the future, end bracket, through the bracket, present, end bracket, apparatus of parliamentary democracy, end quote. Trotsky. Under pressure from Kautsky, Trotsky goes as far as to admit that, in the historical struggle against feudalism, quote, formal, end quote, democratic principles, the individual as an end in himself, universal suffrage, freedom of expression, had played a progressive role. But at present, he insists, in 1920, they exhibit their reactionary aspect. Quote, the setting up of the control of an ideal norm above the real demands of the working masses and the revolutionary parties, end quote. In other words, such principles, and above all the principle which specifies that individual persons have intrinsic, non-instrumental value, introduce an unacceptable constraint upon the otherwise unrestricted recourse to violence, terrorism, and deceit. The essential theoretical differences between Trotsky and Kautsky should now be clear. The former holds that socialism can be achieved only by the violent means of proletarian dictatorship and terrorism. The latter insists, although earlier, bracket, in 1909, end bracket, he was closer to Trotsky's position, that a constitutional winning of power through fair elections, accompanied by propaganda and education, the aims of socialism, is the only way to keep the end uncorrupted. 3. Trotsky's third argument is, in essence, that Bolshevik violence, terror, and deception are, quote, justified because all governments have recourse to such measures. Trotsky cites a number of examples from contemporary 1920 events in Western Europe to support his thesis, and concludes, quote, it would be vain in our time to seek anywhere in the world a regime which did not have recourse to measures of harsh mass repression in order to maintain itself, end quote. For Trotsky, the form and extent of repressive measures, e.g. imprisonment versus shooting, is a matter not of principle but of expediency, and imprisonment is not an effective means of intimidating the counter-revolutionaries, since the latter, as of 1919 to 1920, think that the Bolshevik government will soon be overthrown and that they will be released. Quote, the extensive recourse in the Civil War to execution by shooting, end quote, Trotsky adds, quote, is to be explained by this one simple decisive fact, end quote. Quote, intimidation. Intimidation is a powerful instrument of both foreign and domestic policy, The revolution, kills individuals, and bracket, thus, end bracket, intimidates thousands, end quote. 4. Trotsky next turns briefly to his fourth argument, that the terror was started not by the Bolsheviks but by the counter-revolutionaries, quote, who were supported by foreign money, men, and supplies, end quote. Historically, this is a dubious assertion, but I shall not pause to challenge it. Apart from the question of means and ends, Kautsky says, we must recognize that, quote, even the end, purpose, of Bolshevik terrorism is not unobjectionable. Its immediate task is to maintain control of the military bureaucratic apparatus of power which the Bolsheviks have created, end quote. Trotsky goes even further, quote, the holding down of a discontented proletariat, end quote. Kautsky retorts with irony, quote, such is the noble end which is supposed to sanctify the base means of mass murder in Russia today, end quote. Kautsky. This is not Marxism, Kautsky insists. The Bolsheviks have discarded Marxist theory and retain only the magic slogan, quote, dictatorship of the proletariat, end quote. By using this expression, Trotsky writes, quote, they thought he could gain absolution for all their sins against the spirit of Marxism, end quote. Trotsky predicted, with nonchalant self-assurance, that in the future the terror would be reduced, quote, the further we go, bracket, into the future, end bracket, the easier it will get, the freer each citizen will feel himself to be, the more imperceptible will the coercive force of the proletarian state become, end quote. Trotsky. Trotsky's last point is crucially, and I suspect deliberately ambiguous. Will the coercion be less perceptible because it will actually have lessened, or only because Soviet citizens will have become more thoroughly habituated to it? Kautsky's comment a decade later is worth noting, quote, terror in the Bolshevik system, end quote, Trotsky declared, quote, is not a mere wartime measure, bracket, i.e. one confined to the period of civil war, end bracket. Rather, terror in the Bolshevik system has become more deep-rooted in the 10 years of peace since 1920, end quote. Kautsky. Kautsky's comment, and Kautsky adds that, quote, there are two kinds of counter-revolution, bracket, in Russia, end bracket. The primitive or, quote, white guard, end quote, counter-revolution, and the Bonapartist or fascist Bolshevik counter-revolution, end quote. Kautsky. Was it dead Bolshevism at a dead end? Is that what that piece is called? Der Bolschewismus in der Sackgasse. I don't know if I said end footnote, but there's a footnote and it's over. End footnote. On this anti-Stalinist point, at least, despite their bitter differences on other matters, Kautsky and Trotsky, author of such fiercely anti-Stalinist tracts as The Revolution Betrayed, were in substantial agreement. After an interval of 18 years, Trotsky returned in 1938 to the defense of terrorism. The occasion appears to have been the need to defend himself against mounting charges that in suppressing the 1921 Kronstadt uprising, Trotsky had launched a truly Stalinist terror against members of the working class. Dewey's reasons for joining the debate seem to have been twofold. A. On the one hand, Dewey had just chaired the commission which, in Mexico, had sifted the evidence presented in the Moscow show trial against Trotsky and found it unconvincing. And B. On the other, Dewey did not wish to appear as a defender of Trotsky's Marxist-Leninist views of a kind that Dewey had for decades criticized and rejected. Footnote. As early as 1922, Dewey had referred to the, quote, monstrous, bracket, Marxist, and bracket, belief that class struggle civil war is a means of social progress, end quote. That's from Dewey's Human Nature and Conduct, published in New York, 1922. In 1939, Dewey added perceptively, quote, one may, ... find evidence to support the view that the dictatorship of the proletariat became first that of a party over the proletariat, and then the dictatorship of a small band of bureaucrats over the party, end quote. The latter having, quote, adopted, with greatly improved technical skill and execution, all the repressive measures of the overthrown czarist despotism, end quote. Dewey, Freedom and Culture. The full title of this book is Human Nature and Conduct, an Introduction to Social Psychology. And the description says, the problem with morality, according to pragmatist John Dewey, is that morality assumes an inherent lacking in human nature and then seeks, through constraining rules, punishment, and threat to make humans act differently, act against their nature. This, he claims, is a battle doomed to fail. In Human Nature and Conduct, first published in 1922, John Dewey brings the rigor of natural sciences to the quest for a better moral system. By studying habit, impulse, and intelligence, John Dewey arrives at a morality that is firmly rooted in the context of the world, accounting for thinking humans with individual circumstances that do, indeed, make a difference when determining right and wrong. Students of sociology, philosophy, and psychology will be interested to see moral judgment investigated as a scientific question of one of America's most influential philosophers. American educator and philosopher John Dewey, who lived from 1859 to 1952, helped found the American Association of University Professors. John Dewey served as professor of philosophy at Columbia University from 1904 to 1930 and authored numerous books, including The School and Society, published in 1899, Experience in Nature, 1925, Experience in Education, 1938, and Freedom and Culture, 1939. Freedom and Culture is what we're going to look up next. There's actually a Wikipedia page for Freedom and Culture by John Dewey, and I'm going to read that. Freedom and Culture is a book by John Dewey, published in 1939. Freedom and Culture is an analytical defense of democracy, written in a time when democratic regimes had recently been replaced by non-democratic regimes, and at a time when Marxism was considered a powerful political force. According to Dewey, human nature is the result of many forces, many of which are culturally determined. Attempts have been made to explain human behavior as being primarily motivated by love of freedom, or by pursuit of self-interest, or by the pursuit of power, or being primarily determined by economic conditions. All of these are products of their times, and their inevitable falsification results in a backlash, de-emphasizing the formerly overemphasized factor. According to Dewey, freedom had been associated with individuality by some people, and with rationality or law by others. Freedom has also been associated with the farming class by some people, and with capitalists by others. Individualism or liberty, and social control or law have been proposed as two extremes between which freedom has to navigate. In reality, the individual and social forces interact in various ways, rather than being two distinct extremes. Therefore, for individuals to be free, appropriate social conditions must exist. Democratic conditions do not automatically maintain themselves, and they cannot be mechanically prescribed in a constitution. Dictatorships exist not only through coercion, but also by appealing to certain idealistic elements in people, such as solidarity or the appeal of sharing in the creation of a new system. Public education and press free from government control can be as much a tool for totalitarianism as they are a tool for democracy. They surround the citizens who in a modern state do not have direct contact with the events that affect them, with, quote, ready-made intellectual goods, end quote, making them susceptible to propaganda. New section. Excuse me. not new section. According to Dewey, the leaders of the American rebellion against the British were motivated by restrictions placed on industry and trade and by high taxation. This was rationalized into the idea that all government not self-imposed is foreign to human nature and human rights. This simple theory of democracy was a product of the simple conditions under which it was formulated. There is a widespread desire in human nature for personal freedom, release from dominion over personal beliefs and conduct. The main threat to freedom is the tendency of government officials to extend their power. Therefore, guarantees against abuse of government power are enough to guarantee freedom. This idea is very influential in the U.S. A view that economic development is having an anti-democratic effect and should be controlled by government is more modern, and its existence is an indication that conditions have changed dramatically. Conditions have become more complex, and impersonal forces have been set in motion on an unprecedented scale, resulting in loss of personal control over the personal situation. Modern conditions have rendered the assumed harmony between liberty and equality valid. Also, the tendency toward organization by both labor and capital, that is inherent in economic development, was seen in the original democratic theory as an anti-democratic force. The loss of control motivates both the working class and the capitalist to embrace totalitarian means in the hope of improving security, and distrust of organized labor and capital pushes the public to give more power as a counterbalance to a would-be dictator. Can existing institutions be used to cope with modern problems? Socialists who favor non-revolutionary means suggest regulation of industry or ownership of industry by government. Theory and practice, however, do not show that the resulting situation is essentially different from that of capitalism, leaving the question of how to reconcile modern conditions with democracy open. The chapter Totalitarian Economics and Democracy is a critique of monistic Marxist theory in vogue at the time the book was written. Marxism asserts that social activities and relations are determined solely by economic conditions, rejecting other factors associated with human behavior as having any influence. Original Marxist qualifications to this position, allowing that existing social structures can have influence on subsequent events, is removed. Beyond economic determinism, Marxism states that all social change is the result of class warfare, which moves the workers towards liberation from past subjugation and finally creates a classless society. This law is an economic paraphrase of Hegelian dialectic idealism, in which conflict between ideas results in synthesis and harmony. Marxist theory was a creature of Marxist theory's time, a time when intellectual thought was dealing with social development, or, quote, evolution, calls on necessity, Hegelian philosophy, economically based ideologies, and the search for social theories. Marxism is dated by its search for unifying causality, since while the idea of unifying causality was typical of mid-19th century science, it was abandoned in later scientific thought to be replaced by the idea of invariance, which describes how different phenomena relate to each other, rather than ascribe a single cause for all phenomena. Quote, the inherent theoretical weakness of Marxism is that it supposed a generalization that was made at a particular date and place, and made even then only by bringing observed facts under a premise drawn from a metaphysical source, can obviate the need for continued resort to observation and to continual revision of generalizations in their office of working hypotheses. End quote. Acceptance of Marxism was supported by its discussion of contemporary social phenomena, the struggle between capitalists and factory workers, and economic cycles and concentration. In both its structure and its attraction based on addressing pressing social issues, Marxism is similar to a religious ideology. In the USSR, monistic Marxist theory has been accompanied by the anti-scientific devices of one-party control of all communications and persecution of dissenters. Power has been given to a small group to apply the theory in specific cases, giving that group absolute coercive power deriving from the absolute principle. This occurrence demonstrates that popular representation, multiple parties, and constant criticism of government encourage freedom. Despite the influence of economic factors in politics, these formal devices allow interplay of various tendencies whose result is greatly better than that of a monistic idea. Quote, we cannot continue the idea that human nature, when left to itself, when freed from external arbitrary restrictions, will tend to the production of democratic institutions that work successfully, ... We have to see that democracy means the belief that humanistic culture should prevail. We should be frank and open in our recognition that the proposition is a moral proposition, like any idea that concerns what should be, end quote. Dewey. Quote, science, through science physical and technological consequences, is now determining the relations between human beings. If it is incapable of developing moral techniques which will also determine these relations, the split in modern culture goes so deep that not only democracy but all civilized values are doomed. A culture that permits science to destroy traditional values but which distrusts its power to create new ones is a culture which is destroying itself. End quote. Dewey. Okay, thank you for that um, uh, detour. Um, back to the text and footnote. Dewey feared that his defense of Trotsky from Stalinist injustice would be interpreted as a defense of Trotsky's views of terrorism and the dictatorship of the proletariat. As John Dewey put it, if Trotsky were cleared by the Dewey Commission, he would be cleared only of, quote, the specific charges which he was convicted in the Moscow trials, end quote. His, quote, political ideas and policies, end quote, would in no way be vindicated. Footnote, see the later works of John Dewey, edited by Brotherstone, 1981, Volume 2. Come on. The description for John Dewey's, the volume, the later works of John Dewey, Volume 2, 1925 to 1953, 1927, or, well, actually, no, that's the later works of John Dewey, is from 1925 to 1953. But this specific volume, Volume 2, covers 1925 to 1927. And it's titled Essays, Reviews, Miscellany, and the Public and Its Problems. The description for this book says, quote, why I'm saying quote, the description says, with the exception of Experience in Nature, Volume 1 of the later works, this volume contains all of Dewey's writings from 1925 and 1926, as well as Dewey's 1927 book, The Public and Its Problems, a Modern Language Association's Committee on Scholarly Editions textual edition. The first essay in this volume, The Development of American Pragmatism, is perhaps Dewey's best-known article of these years, emphasizing the uniquely American origins of Dewey's own philosophical innovations. Other essays focus on Dewey's continuing investigation of the, quote, nature of intelligent conduct, end quote, as for example his debate with David White Prawl on the underpinnings of value, his study of sense perception, and his support for outlawing of war. Also appearing here are Dewey's final articles on the culture of the developing world, written for the New Republic after his travels to China, Trotsky, and Mexico. Travels to China, Turkey, and Mexico, Jesus Christ. Anyway, back to the text and footnote. In contrast to Kautsky, Dewey made no effort to dissociate Trotsky's views on terrorism from those of Marx, but Dewey introduced a fresh and important distinction between two different senses of the word, quote, end, in Trotsky's assertion that, quote, the end justifies the means. A, quote, end, in the sense of objective future consequences of present choice and action, and B, end in the sense of, quote, end in view, end quote, or telos, the presently envisaged future goal to be brought about by present choice and action. Dewey notes that the end in view tends to be relegated to a hazy and remote historical future, whereas Volan's Nolans, the first of the many objective consequences of present action, will tend to emerge in the relatively short-term future. I'm going to look up Volan's Nolans. Nolens volens is a Latin phrase which means unwillingly or willingly, whether willingly or not, or willy-nilly. It's used to indicate that something must be done even if you don't want to do it. For example, the doctor told me that I had to take my medicine every day, willingly or unwillingly, if I wanted to get better. Back to the text. Dewey asserts forcefully that means and ends, in both senses, are interdependent and continuous. Dewey charges Trotsky with subordinating the professed end, the end in view, to the instrumentality of violent class struggle, proclaimed as the only possible effective means. Footnote. There are useful discussions of the Dewey-Trotsky polemic in Kneipp's Social and Political Thought of Leon Trotsky, and in Luke's Marxism and Morality. However, neither commentator recognizes the importance of Trotsky's powerful future orientation or his instrumentalizing of the lives of present persons. Back to the text, end footnote. Since for Trotsky, Dewey writes, quote, the view that class struggle is the only means to reach deductively is reached deductively and not by an inductive examination of the means consequences in their interdependence. The means, the class struggle, does not need to be critically examined with respect to its actual objective consequences. It is automatically absolved from all need for critical examination. ... The end in view, parenthesis, as distinct from objective consequences, end parenthesis, justifies the use of any means in line with the class struggle, and ... justifies the neglect of all other means, end quote. John Dewey. Perhaps the following reformulation will make Dewey's point somewhat clearer. According to Dewey, Trotsky accepts an end in view, E, and asserts that to attain this end one must resort to certain means, M, class struggle, terrorism, etc. But Dewey maintains when we use M, certain, perhaps unanticipated objective consequences, C, ensues, and some or all of these consequences are incompatible with E. Yet they were generated by M, which was asserted to be essential to the attainment of E. The reason for this paradoxical situation, Dewey argues, is that M is arbitrarily declared to be the only possible means to E, and thus is exempted from critical examination, and in particular from an investigation as to its probable objective consequences. C. Such analysis and criticism, if undertaken, would have made it clear that M would probably generate objective consequences. C. That would be incompatible with, or would, quote, undermine, end quote, the original end in view, E. Quote, it is one thing, bracket, Dewey continues, end bracket, to say that class struggle is a means of attaining the end of the liberation of mankind. It is a radically different thing to say that there is an absolute law of class struggle which determines the means to be used. For, if it determines the means, it also determines the end, the actual consequence, end quote. John Dewey. There are many ways, Dewey points out, of carrying on a class struggle. We should choose critically among them, assuming that we have adopted, quote, class struggle in general as the appropriate means for achieving our end in view, which Dewey himself did not, by examining their consequences, not by deduction from an alleged, quote, law of history. Dewey, who made a central place for the category of habit in his own ethical and social theory, is, I think, suggesting that the Trotskyite recourse to terror might become habitual, that the objective consequences of such a historical habit might be a kind of institutionalization of terrorism, and that such a habit might prove extremely hard to break, might indeed last for generations. To put the point differently, Dewey is presciently suggesting that the Marxist-Leninist terrorism so passionately defended by Leon Trotsky would lead to the institutionalized terrorism of Stalin's fully fledged totalitarian system. The only point, and it is a central point, that Trotsky did not clearly articulate is that Trotsky's defense of terrorism was underpinned by his Marxist-Leninist devaluing and instrumentalizing of the historical present for the sake of the, quote, radiant future of communism, end quote. The end. Thank you for listening.